You are listening to the Virginia Press Room,
a joint production of the Virginia Public Access Project
and VPM. Now here's the host of the Press Room, Michael Pope.
In the press room this week, we are joined by an all-star panel of journalists from the Virginia Press Corps. First up is the state politics reporter for Cardinal News, Elizabeth Beyer. Thanks for joining us.
Howdy, happy to be here.
We are also joined by the state politics reporter for WRIC ABC 8 here in Richmond, Tyler Englander. Thanks for joining us.
Honored to be considered an all-star.
All-star. Rounding out our all-star panel is the state politics reporter for VPM News. He is the first person to make a second appearance on the podcast. Jad Khalil, thanks for returning to the press room.
Yeah, good to be back.
All right, let's get right into it with our headlines of the week. Elizabeth Beyer of Cardinal News, you're first on this. What's your headline of the week?
Yeah, so I'm actually not sure when the story's going to drop, but we finished, myself and a colleague, Emily Shabacker, who is the health reporter for Cardinal. We teamed up on a story about what could happen if the federal government rescinds Medicaid expansion. That's something that's been kind of like kicked around by Republicans, I think, for a little bit of time. Medicaid expansion was adopted along with the Affordable Care Act in 2010, and then each state subsequently adopted it on a state-by-state basis over the following years. And so Virginia adopted it in 2018, and I think there's close to 700,000 people in Virginia who have received Medicaid benefits under Medicaid expansion, and the federal government and Republicans have, discussed unwinding Medicaid on the federal level, and we're kind of seeing little inklings of that here and there as the 119th Congress kicks off with a Republican majority, and we have President Donald Trump back in office. And during his first term, he and congressional Republicans kind of pushed for the overturning of the ACA and got pretty close in the Senate. But do you remember that drama in 2017 when John...
there was a lot of drama.
Yeah.
There was certainly
a lot of drama. But this one instance when the late Senator John McCain came back from having surgery and was the deciding vote, big old thumbs down. So people are concerned that could happen again. And with Republican majorities in both chambers, it could get passed and then signed if it gets to President Trump's desk. And so Emily and I are kind of looking into what could happen in Virginia if Medicaid is rescinded on a federal, or Medicaid expansion is rescinded on a federal level. And an interesting piece of information about that is when Virginia adopted Medicaid expansion in 2018, a piece of trigger language was included in that adoption that basically said the Virginia General Assembly would have to rethink the state's participation in the program if the federal grant or the federal funds, the federal matching funds for Medicaid expansion dropped below 90%. And with potential funding rollbacks for Medicaid expansion, that could potentially happen. So if, funding is decreased on a federal level, then Virginia would kind of go into this situation where the General Assembly would have to kind of scramble and figure that out. So Senator Creigh Deeds, who's a Democrat from Charlottesville, he introduced a budget amendment recently for this year. He introduced a budget amendment, which would basically take out that language that was passed in 2018. And we'll see what happens in the General Assembly session.
Elizabeth, because of your reporting on this issue, I tracked down Senator Deeds last week and asked him about his budget amendment. And he said that it's not going to pass.
Oh, boy. Okay.
And that he is predicting a special session, get ready for it, special session to deal with the Medicaid expansion. And or do those people lose their health insurance? Are they kicked off? Does Virginia pay a lot of money so that they can continue their health insurance? This Medicaid expansion, the rolling back the Obamacare Medicaid expansion is going to be something that I think we're just starting to be on the front end of this, and I think this is a long story that's going to play out of the rest of this calendar year.
So wait, he said it was not going to pass. So did he say why? I mean, and he's talking about going through the committees that are controlled by his own party, right? Is that what you're talking about? Or is
I mean, his assessment of the situation was that he was not expecting his budget amendment to pass, and that he was expecting a special session on this issue later this year.
What you hear is the heart rate going up of legislative staffers across the Commonwealth when they hear the word special session.
And even people
reporters.
I was about to say this table as well.
I'm going to need to refill the coffee machine.
Tyler Englander, you're next on this. What's your headline of the week?
Well, I think it's interesting. Every General Assembly session, education plays a big role. Obviously, every year, no matter who the governor is, they tout how much they're investing in public education. I think it's really interesting how school choice has played a really big role in the first 2 weeks of this General Assembly session. Obviously, when the governor unveiled his budget amendments, he had this Virginia Opportunity Scholarship Program that would provide $5,000 scholarships to 10,000 low-income families to help them attend private school. Obviously, that has no chance of passing, and we've heard that from Democrats, from Louise Lucas, who chairs Senate Finance and Appropriations. If she says it's not happening, it's probably not happening. Ask Glenn Youngkin about an arena in Northern Virginia if you need any reference on that. But I think it's really interesting, this debate over school choice, and can you invest in K through 12 public education while also providing these alternative pathways? And I think Republicans are arguing, in a press conference last week, Delegate Mike Cherry, who used to run his own private school, a private Christian school, I believe, in Chesterfield, said, I've seen what the right opportunity can do in the life of a student. So I think it's really fascinating. Can you balance, is there a balance to put money in K through 12 education while also providing these alternative pathways? Republicans say yes, Democrats say no. For now, Democrats are in charge of the General Assembly, so what they say goes. I just think it's really fascinating on that front. And then there was this whole Stella Pekarsky homeschool bill, which took on a life of its own last week in the General Assembly. I just want to, read the headline from my story because it was shocking to me. Did you know that it's legal in Virginia not to give your child any sort of education? I've been here for a year and a half. I always think I know what issues are going to come up in the General Assembly session. This was not one of them. Apparently, if you have a religious exemption, you're not required to, if you homeschool your kids through a religious exemption, you're not required to provide any paperwork telling your local school division, hey, I'm teaching my kid this subject. At the end of the year, you're not required to put any, documentation saying, here's how they're making progress. And that story took on a life of its own. Stella Pekarsky, who's from Northern Virginia, state senator, put in a bill to try and require that if you're under a religious exemption, you have to provide paperwork or documentation like any other students who are homeschooled. And that faced some backlash from people who said it violated their, religious freedom. I just think education has been a really fascinating issue in the first couple of weeks of this session.
Yeah, I talked to Senator Pekarsky about that bill, and she was saying that she, not only is she former chair of the Fairfax School Board, she also actually homeschooled one of her own children. And to meet this requirement that you're talking about, she sent an email basically outlining, this is how I'm educating my kid. So the problem is, if you talk to people on the other side of this issue, they will say, well, they don't want to send the email to the government. They don't think that the government should play a role in how they're educating their kids. And there's a theoretical possibility that the child might get zero education, but we don't know of any examples of that, right?
Well, Senator Pekarsky told me in an interview, and then she also, when she presented her bill in committee, that, and there were people who testified that were under this religious exemption who were not prepared for college or to go into the world after, they left home. So there are at least anecdotal evidence of, certain cases where kids were not getting an education at all. And that's, what Senator Pekarsky says prompted her to bring this legislation. I just think it's really interesting. And it's, another example of, religion and, how the government and religion are intertwined, even though the Constitution says the U.S. has no official religion. It's just interesting.
I mean, one person on the other side of that is Glenn Youngkin, too, right? Governor Glenn Youngkin's on the other side of this bill. I think there was an Instagram post that I think was, tens of kids or families in the one of the governor's office buildings telling people to vote against the bill.
Yeah, well, the governor made a personal appearance at the press conference with the homeschool crowd. Rare appearance from the governor at a press conference in the General Assembly building. But obviously, it's a topic that he's really interested in, and one might even expect that Senator Pekarsky's bill might receive his veto.
I think he's showing up more this session in some way. I mean, he showed up to that. There was a press conference on right to work that he showed up to that the lieutenant governor was holding. So I'm trying to think back to last year how often the governor was appearing and lobbying for specific legislation. That was something that we kind of saw more of early on in his term when he had his list of like legislative priorities, and they sort of stopped doing that.
Well, I think it's interesting. I think the governor probably knows this is his last full year in office. This is his last real legislative session, barring a special session, on other issues. The governor's trying to kind of define his legacy a little bit. We mentioned that arena a little bit earlier. That didn't happen. That was supposed to be his legacy project. He certainly, brought, what he says is $5 billion in tax relief, but no meaningful long-term tax relief, such as, cuts in the income tax that he's wanted. So I think the governor is trying to kind of find his place to put some sort of legacy stamp on his administration, whether that's with school choice, whether that's with what he calls an opportunity scholarship, with what Democrats call vouchers. I think it's really interesting. I think you're right. I don't remember seeing the governor at a press conference led by lawmakers, led by a state senator or a state delegate at all last year. And I do think he's been more hands-on because I think, his car tax proposal is another one. He wants to have some sort of long-term success that he could point to down the road and say, this is my legacy as Virginia's governor. And who knows, he might need to point to that on a debate stage, in a couple of years if he decides to run for president.
I'm sure he would love school choice to be part of his legacy, but there's one person standing in the way of that, and that is the chairwoman of the Senate Finance Committee. She said it's a non-starter. So, I mean, it's doubtful that will end up being part of his legacy. Jad Khalil, you're next on this. What's your headline of the week?
So my headline of the week is the Governor Glenn Youngkin's reaction to President Trump's new executive orders on federal workers. So as listeners and viewers probably know, there's lots of federal employees in Virginia, especially in Northern Virginia. And so President Trump issued a couple of executive orders that are going to really affect those workers. And one is a requirement to return to office. And on that, Governor Glenn Youngkin was very enthusiastically in support of that. And he has kind of, he has said that before. And that's just something else that Senator Mark Warner, who's a Democrat, is also in support of. And they point to Metro funding as coming from federal workers. It's something like 40% of the Washington Metropolitan Transport Authority. I think I got that acronym right, but they are federal workers. So they're saying that this is a good way to cover what's $750 million budget shortfall. So that was one. And the other one that he was replying to was the reclassification of federal workers under Schedule F, which is sort of the short version, is that it gives the presidency more control over the federal bureaucracy. And this is coming in tandem as President Trump has said that he wants to move 100,000 federal jobs out of the DMV. So that would obviously affect a lot of Virginia workers. And the governor didn't, he offered support for that. It wasn't as clear as he was when he was talking to me about the it wasn't as clear as when he was talking to me about the return to office order, but he said that there might be some people that lose their jobs, and that there's lots of job openings in Virginia that they could move into. And so, also for the story, I talked to Majority Leader Scott Serville, who's a Democrat, who was like, this is just cover for Governor Youngkin putting himself in with Trump and being afraid of, the tech billionaires that are backing him, who have put a lot of money into the President Trump's election campaign. So.
It does seem like the Democrats in the General Assembly are doing all manner of things to prepare for what they think might happen in a Trump administration. We talked about Senator Deed's budget amendment on making sure people that have health insurance can keep it under Medicaid expansion. That's one example of that. And then also Senator Aaron Rouse has a bill that would create a 30-day delay for evicting a federal worker who's not getting a paycheck because of a government shutdown. And so the government shutdown might actually happen in like mid-March.
There's also last week, Senator Sorrell was saying on the Senate floor in regards to confirmations, something important happened on January 20th, which is that we got a new president, and then, we shouldn't really expect, the majority to sort of, I don't know what his exact words were, but it was more or less like, you can't just expect us to go along with anything because of the, who's, to borrow a term from Senator Louise Lucas, like, the other side of the river. So.
All right, now it's time for some insider info. This is when our reporters reveal the story behind the story, giving us an inside scoop on Virginia politics. Tyler Englander of ABC 8, you're first on this. What's your insider info?
I wouldn't say insider info, but I would say one of the more interesting aspects of this session, and we've talked about it in the press room, I know all of us have, is are Democrats simply going through the motions? Is this General Assembly session really about passing as many bills as humanly possible within reason, what you can do in 45 days, really 42 because of Richmond's water crisis, but how many bills can you pass and force the governor to veto? It almost feels that way because if you think about in some of the bills that have passed, I'm thinking of Senator Aaron Rouse's bill you just mentioned to set up a retail market for recreational marijuana. Last year, when Democrats had control of the House and the Senate, which they still do, but that was the first year last year, the subcommittee hearing on that bill was hours. I remember getting there at 8 in the morning, and finally at 11:30, Scott Sorrell said, we have to get to caucus and we have to get to the floor. I mean, it went forever. They talked about every little thing in that bill. This year when it was in committee, 10 minutes, maybe. Nobody really testified. You didn't have a whole bunch of Republicans saying this is why it's bad, because in his State of the Commonwealth address, Governor Glenn Youngkin basically implied that he was going to veto the bill anyway. You can think about it with a variety of other things. The skill games bill that got a second life last week, the governor's not going to sign that. And you get the sense that there are people coming here to testify for very important things for their community. Democrats are going to pass them and then just point to the governor and say, hey, he doesn't like you because he vetoed all these bills. I think it's really interesting. Last week, I know many of us did stories on bills to remove tax exemptions from Confederate organizations. It's a bill that the governor vetoed last year. Last year, I remember there being quite a bit of debate on it. I was in the House floor last week. No debate on it. It passed. Because if you're a Republican, you're probably thinking to yourself, why would I say something controversial when I don't have to? The governor's just going to veto it. And I think if you're Democrats, they're playing the game as well. You want to put as many issues that you think are important, that you think your constituents think are important, and issues that you think are going to be important come Election Day in November. And then you want to point to it and say, hey, I passed this bill, which is important to my constituents, and the governor vetoed it. I think there's this game within the game. Democrats are trying to say, hey, here are all the issues that are important to us. We're going to pass them. We're going to go through the motions, even though we know it's not happening when it comes to Governor Glenn Youngkin signing them. And the governor's happy to oblige because his game also is his future, whether that's in a Trump administration, whether that's running for president, whether that's challenging Mark Warner for a Senate seat in a couple of years. So I think it's, both sides playing the political game. But I think last year was something like 200 vetoes from the governor. I think we'll probably see something similar.
Yeah, there certainly is an expectation that a lot of the stuff that's going to come out of the democratically controlled General Assembly is going to get the veto pen. And in fact, as you pointed out, there are lots of specific bills that he vetoed last year that they're trying again this year. But they do want stuff to put in their brochures. These are, people call them brochure bills because this is an election year, right?
Look, I love, the attention we give the General Assembly. I think that, people deserve a right to know what their lawmakers are doing. but some of what lawmakers are doing is just to get media attention.
What?
And I'm not saying the issues that they're pushing are not important, but as the governor mentioned in his State of the Commonwealth on, the retail market for recreational marijuana, we've got a very small amount of time, 45 days for the entire year to make changes for the Commonwealth, and people are focused on things that are not going to pass. I'm not saying they shouldn't be focused on it. I think that Senator Aaron Rouse strongly believes that a retail market for recreational marijuana is good for the Commonwealth. I'm not saying that he doesn't think that. However, it's interesting to me what people are focused on when they know it's not going to be signed into law anyway.
Chad Khalil of VPM News, you're next on this. What's your insider info?
So this kind of gets back a little bit to what we were talking about in terms of being contentious on the Senate floor. So there was a moment last week when Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl-Sears ruled that the Majority Leader Scott Survell, who was also mentioning earlier, it was out of order. So there was this moment where, and then he was speaking. The Lieutenant Governor said that he wasn't supposed to impugn or insult somebody, and that was the Senator Survell was talking about abortion, and he said something along the lines of that Mitch McConnell stole a Supreme Court seat, and that meant that Virginia had to have this debate. So last week they passed constitutional amendments protecting abortion, contraception, fertility care, those sorts of things. And Virginia had to do that because of the Supreme Court decision, which was caused by this alleged theft. So enter Lieutenant Governor, bangs on the gavel. There's a couple of reporters that jumped because it was quite.
It was loud. It was not only was it really loud, there was also no delay. I mean, like right as the words came out of Survell's mouth, it was like bam, she really hit that gavel hard.
Yeah. So she said you're out of order, and then the Majority Leader was sort of puzzled. He seemed surprised to me. I don't know. It was like so he was kind of like, he made a face. He was like, what? Like, what are you talking about? There was some back and forth, and eventually he ended up challenging her ruling. And
But he also said, like, you're not a member of this body.
Oh yeah, yeah.
He said this is
shut the heck up,
this
basically.
is our chamber,
This is
which
our
stuck
chamber.
out to me as well.
Yeah.
Huh. Wow. But yeah, so he was like, I'm going to challenge the chair's ruling, and you kind of saw Republicans kind of be like, oh, this isn't a path that we want to go down. This is sort of like unnecessary. So they went on a break for 15 minutes as they tried to figure out what they were going to do, and then there was like, it was kind of funny. Like they went to the rules and they're like, okay, like each side gets 5 minutes. So Survell backed himself up, and then Bill Stanley, who's a trial lawyer, if I'm not mistaken, also gave a speech, and then eventually she was overruled. So it was one of these moments where it was like high tension that did not affect the policy outcome whatsoever.
And it was about something that
so-
happened in 2016 in
Yeah.
Washington. I mean, it was really irrelevant to anything in Virginia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it was, I mean, for politics watchers, it's interesting. That's why I put it in my insider info section versus headline of the week. But that was what stood out to me last week.
Look, I mean, I think there's some politics behind it. I think the lieutenant governor, she's running for governor, and, any chance she can get to say or show, hey, I'm challenging Democrats on, even though this was not an issue in the General Assembly, but I'm challenging Democrats, is probably good for her brand in a Republican, primary, even though there might not be a Republican
Even
primary.
if she's overruled?
Honestly, I don't really think anybody cares about what happened. This is like a serious.
Jad does. He put it in.
No,
he put it in the
insider
rundown.
info.
I'm not making fun of John, but
don't
no,
discount Jad.
I
Come
do
on.
think this is the sort of inside baseball that we love.
Yeah.
The public might not necessarily care. I would also chalk it up to something like this. You can have people you work with who you like. When you spend 45 days with them, in a row, there are going to be some disagreements. I'm not saying Survell likes Winsome Sears or vice versa. It happens. I don't think there was any serious intent, again, maybe the lieutenant governor was trying to say, hey, I'm challenging Democrats. I don't know. People work together for 45 days, you know. I shared a room with my twin brother for a lot longer than 45 days. We get into a lot of fights over nothing, so it happens.
Yeah, I'm waiting to see like what kind of blow-ups happen in the newsroom after 45 days too. Since this is my first full session.
Oh, in the press room, it's kumbaya. We all love each other.
I don't know about that.
Elizabeth Byer, you're next on this. What's your insider info?
Oh, my insider info. What is my insider info? Hold on, I'm blanking.
Sourcing for stories.
Sourcing for stories. Great, thank you so much. So, you know, I don't know if anyone else at this table gets this, but I get it a lot. Like, how do you find real people to talk to for your stories, right? Like, not just the newsmakers or the legislators, but like what about the people who are actually like affected by, you know, these policies that folks are putting forth? So how do we find sources? How do we find real people sources? So there was a story during the election season.
You could put out the call here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Please talk to us.
Will you be giving out your phone number?
Absolutely
Please-
not. But I'll
please
give you
don't,
my
please
email
don't.
address. But yeah, so there was a story over the election season where Governor Glenn Youngkin rolled back access to voting, or he kind of like rescinded. He like rolled back vote. Hold on, I don't have like the.
Oh, the executive
Is this
order
the
one.
DMV?
Yeah, it's a DMV thing. It's like when he kicked. Oh, sorry, he kicked like thousands of people off the voter rolls. I think that's the proper terminology for it, or attempted to. Anyway, so myself and my colleagues at Cardinal, we kind of like did something that my editors like to call a swarm, where everybody started working on this story.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and we kind of like got together and we were like, okay, how are we going to find these people? So, you know, obviously voters, you go to the registrar to get those voter rolls. So we put in some FOIA requests. That's Freedom of Information Act for those not in the know. FOIA requests, and got like lists of people and their addresses who were, you know, affected by this, to try to like talk to them and see if they were, you know, erroneously removed from the voter rolls. And so we kind of like spread out all across the Southwest region and put in those requests. Some of the responses that we got for those requests were like, from the registrars, were like, hey, you have to come into these offices and like view these lists in person. We can't send them like electronically. And then some offices actually sent us the lists electronically. So we got those names, got those addresses, and unfortunately, because I'm stuck in Richmond, I wasn't able to pound the pavement, but my colleagues did. And the people that they found were pretty interesting. Like there were a lot of them, you know, they were United States citizens. They were Virginia voters and Virginia residents, but they, you know, erroneously checked or forgot to check a box on a DMV form. And that kind of like triggered them being removed from the voter rolls under Governor Glenn Youngkin's executive order. And there was like a process where those folks were notified via mail, and then they could like go into the registrar and say, hey, here's my, you know, proof of residency. I'm actually like a legitimate voter. And you know, some of those circumstances or situations were resolved, but who knows how many weren't and how many people weren't able to vote.
One way that we find stories is, you know, every author page. So if you end up reading a story that I do, or, you know, Patrick Larson does, or you know, he was on the podcast last week, or 2 weeks ago. You can click on our name, and there's usually a place on our author page where you can answer a question. So I think mine is like, what are you most wanting to hear about this General Assembly session? So there'll be somebody that would ask that. We also have something called People's Agenda. So it's vpm.org/People's Agenda. And if you go there, you can also, you know, type in what you want to hear about. And, you know, oftentimes it's people that have some sort of connection to it, and you find out, like, you know, why they were interested in that topic or that sort of thing. So,
I mean, I would add, some of our best stories come from you guys, come from viewers, listeners, you know, people who are reading Cardinal, things like that, because there are, you know, 1,000+ bills filed during a General Assembly session, probably a lot more. We are not experts on everything, and there's no way in 45 days we can follow every single thing. So if you're interested in something, let us know. I would also say, stop us in the hallway. I had a woman the other day stop me in the hallway and talk about this bill that I had no idea even existed. It's pretty fascinating. Apparently, if you're adopted, you're not entitled to your original birth certificate because there are rights and privacy rights for your birth parents, and your birth certificate would have their information on it. And this woman, who was a parent of someone who was adopted, she stopped me in the hallway. She saw that I was, she says nicely dressed. I don't know about that, but she saw someone nicely dressed and just started chatting with me about it. I had no idea the bill even existed, and I looked through LIS more than most people should in a lifetime in a couple of days. So, if you've got a story, let us know about it. We don't know everything.
Yeah, message to listeners, message to our viewers on YouTube. Hit us up. You're a constituent of the elected officials, but I guess you could say that people, the journalists also have constituents too, right? Our viewers and our listeners.
Well, we're supposed to be accountable to the public also.
All right. Well, now it's time for our game show segment, Buy, Sell, or Hold. I'll present a topic, and our panelists will make a choice. Do they want to buy, sell, or hold? Our topic today, recognizing guests in the gallery. Much of the floor sessions, sometimes a majority of the floor sessions, are dominated by members of the General Assembly recognizing visiting guests up in the gallery. So this is our topic today. Jad Khalil, you're first on this. Buy, sell, or hold on recognizing guests in the gallery.
So clarifying question. We're talking about the legislative act of recognizing them, not me, recognizing the people. Be like, oh, that's so-and-so.
In the Senate, sometimes they spend more than an hour on this, recognizing the Girl Scouts and recognizing Miss Virginia and recognizing the visiting delegation from Fluvanna County and that sort of thing.
I think I'm going to go buy on this one because it's sort of a connection and participation that people have. I think that's basically my answer. It's pretty short.
You don't feel like it gets tedious?
I think it's also a way that legislators signal what is important to them or who's important, who's a stakeholder. Why is something important? Why should we care about this bill? These are things that people that are affected.
It also kind of becomes an open mic moment for the lieutenant governor, who has to just kind of vamp and to talk about Miss Virginia. Miss Virginia. All of a sudden, what are you going to say to Miss Virginia? She's staring at you.
She does that more than in the House. I feel like in the House they don't really sort of muse on whoever's there, or kind of it's a little more procedural.
Elizabeth Beyer, you're next on this. Buy, sell, or hold on recognizing guests in the gallery.
Oh my God, that's a hard one. It's a hard one because it is tedious, but for all the reasons that Jad just mentioned, it's important. And it also gives me an opportunity to get a snack or get a coffee or
this
use
is
the
actually
restroom or something.
very important. I mean, this is maybe a little insider info kind of thing, but this is frequently when the members of the General Assembly literally eat their lunch, right? So if you're not standing up and recognizing somebody in the gallery, you've got a half hour, 45 minutes, maybe an hour of downtime. And it's the only moment in their day when they're not, in front of a committee or that sort of thing.
Some more insider info. Press is also not allowed to eat on the floor, in the chamber, in the gallery during that time. So it's oftentimes where I look down and see Bill Stanley or somebody else having a great meal, and I'm just sitting here starving.
McDougal always gets Chick-fil-A delivered to the Senate floor.
I wonder how much that costs.
Apparently he
Every day.
likes Chick-fil-A. Okay, Tyler Englander, you're last on this. And I will have to say, for our listeners and our viewers, this is a topic that I took from one of your social media posts because you were a little bit critical of the members of the General Assembly wasting your time with recognizing guests in the gallery.
So let me put it this way. I am going to buy recognizing guests in the gallery after I was critical last week. Here is why I'm kind of critical of it. I'm a television reporter. My deadline is 4 o'clock every day. 12 o'clock is already, halfway through my day. And then we go through an hour of introductions before we even get to the bills, which my story is going to be on. It just takes a lot of time. It is tedious. The reason why it needs to happen is a variety of reasons. One, people need to feel like they're being heard. So when your lawmaker stands up and says, hey, I'm recognizing, the future farmers of America, which I believe Bobby Orrock did yesterday in the House. These students and the adults feel that they've been listened to, even if they already met in his office. They feel like they're a part of the process. I would also say I'm 25. I come from a generation, that has political apathy, that's not necessarily involved in the political process. I think the simple act of recognizing them, even though it does take so much time and causes me some anxiety about turning my story in time, we can't ever fault people for coming to be involved in the political process. If we look at, voter turnout in this country compared to other countries, it's pretty abysmal. So I think it would be pretty hypocritical to say, hey, don't show up to where lawmakers are making decisions on your behalf. However, with that being said, I am unaware that they do introductions in Congress.
Sometimes they're really fun. I remember one year, Senator Danica Rome, who was in the House of Delegates at the time, introduced a couple of people from a metal band. So that was
fun.
Yeah, today there was a bunch of junior fox hunters in the gallery also. So
They were all dressed really nice, right? Like in sports coats.
I can't remember, but yeah. So it's just like sort of random parts of Virginia that I wouldn't say random, but it's parts of Virginia that you may not be familiar with. So yeah.
Tyler, I want to know when this change of heart happened between
Oh,
today
probably
and
the
when you
response you got to a
posted.
social media post.
No, I always felt that way. I think, as I said, it is very tedious. And, maybe there's a limit. We do 10 introductions a day, not 30. I think, the issue for me is, especially when I set up with my camera in the House chamber, you've got, 200 seats in the gallery maybe, and you've got 700 people waiting to get in, and they're only staying just to be introduced. It creates this little, I don't want to say circus effect, but, people shuffling in and out in the middle of session. But, as I said, in the grand scheme of things, people being involved in their government is not a bad thing. So I'm certainly not recommending getting rid of introductions. Just as a reporter,
I know, I'm with
it
you.
is a little bothersome.
They spend an hour recognizing, visiting elementary school students, and I'm thinking to myself, all things considered, starts at 4. I got deadlines to be here.
I'm thinking of, the bill that we discussed earlier that, would remove tax exemptions from certain Confederate organizations. And, I set up in the House chamber at 11:45, ready to go. Introductions took about an hour. The bill was heard 10 minutes later. There's only 45 days in this session. There's a finite amount of time to actually get things done in a General Assembly session. It's just interesting to me that so much of it is taken up by not actually legislating.
All right, now it's time to open up our reporter's notebook. This is when our top journalists tell us what to be on the lookout for this week. Elizabeth Beyer of Cardinal News, you're first with this. What's in your reporter's notebook?
Whoa, I'm a top journalist.
Top journalists.
So I'm looking forward to crossover, specifically to see what bills from the Southwest and South Side lawmakers are making it through. As a lot of people know, the Southwest and South Side region of Virginia is it's like a Republican stronghold. And, the General Assembly, both chambers, there's a Democratic majority. So it's going to be, and a lot of the committees that these bills are being heard in have Democratic majorities. So as a result, it'll be interesting to see what makes it through, what makes it to the floor, what is potentially headed to the governor's desk from our regions. So I'm excited for that.
Yeah, as we get closer to crossover, I'm also going to be taking a look at how long these meetings are going to be, because don't forget, because of the water crisis, we missed 3 full days.
Yeah, when are we going to have weekend sessions? I heard about
That's
that.
coming. I believe over the
Okay.
weekend. I believe there
I
was
believe there are Sunday hearings this weekend, isn't that?
over the weekend.
Over the weekend, yes.
There was a committee meeting, right? So I mean, but that's that's not really going to solve the problem, because all these committees have this crush of legislation that they're going to have to consider. So where that's really going to become an issue is crossover, where, as we get closer, those committee meetings are going to go longer and later, and potentially even on the weekend. All right, Tyler Englander of ABC 8. What's in your reporter's notebook?
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to when both the House and Senate release their budget amendments. I've heard many times, in the year and a half that I've been here, that a budget is a reflection of your priorities. One, particular bill that I covered last week that I'm, interested in looking at and was also a budget amendment was from Kerry Coyner, a delegate from Chesterfield, and Delegate Brianna Sewell. They've got this 5,000 families pilot program. I think all of us, no matter what beat you cover, we talk about access to affordable housing constantly. It's an issue in every corner of the Commonwealth. And this program would provide monthly rental assistance to 5,000 low-income Virginia families with school-age children. Part of the impetus behind it is that, if you're a student moving school districts during the school year, that pretty much sets you up for failure. And the goal of this rental assistance program will be to ensure that kids and families have stable housing, kids can spend the full year in their school in order to set them up for success in life. That's one of the things I'm looking at, in the budget amendments once they come out. I'm also just fascinated to see how different they are from what the amendments that the governor proposed. Remember last year, we had a budget special session during reconvene. Republicans and Democrats came out and just basically threw the budget out and said, we'll start all over again. I think it's interesting to see if we're going to be headed down that same path.
I think the last time we had amendments, it was September when they actually got 2 years ago.
Correct.
That they had.
Yeah, right around Labor Days when they figured it out.
I remember at that press conference, they said that it would cost a not insignificant amount of money. Well, as it turns out, that's $80 million. I mean, that's a lot of money, even for the state budget of Virginia. We do have a surplus, though, so, I guess there's money to burn, right?
You're talking about the pilot program?
Mm-hmm.
Very similar to Michael's credit card statement. A not insignificant amount of money is owed.
Ouch.
Chad Khalil, bring it on home here for the conclusion of this episode. What's in your reporter's notebook?
So budget is definitely in there. I think one thing that I am looking forward to this week is a story that I did last week, which was a story about tribal sovereignty. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with tribal sovereignty, it's a concept that sets up a government-to-government relationship between Native American tribal nations and the Commonwealth of Virginia. Sometimes it's with the federal government. Virginia is sort of interesting because, I shouldn't say sort of, it is interesting because a lot of relationships with tribal nations predate the United States because Virginia is so old. So it wasn't until about a decade ago that the tribal nations of Virginia got federal recognition. And so that meant that Virginia's law was out of sync with federal regulations, so there was like two sets of rules to follow and that sort of thing. So this is part of recently there's been, a crush of bills, to borrow a term that you used, about the relationship between the Commonwealth and Native tribes. So that bill passed out of committees last week, and I'm looking out to see if it's going to come up again.
I know nothing about tribal nations, so this is all Jod's beat. But I will say this. Think about all the things we said, budget, tribal nations. There are so many different issues that come up in a 45-day General Assembly session. I mean, there are 10,000 different issues. My credit goes to the lawmakers who have to know everything about this and decide on each one of these things, because there's a lot of stuff.
And the staff, it's like, for every legislator that's like, the public face, there's not only their staff, but, people that are staff of the actual legislature that are, kind of helping out get these bills across the line.
Yeah, how do people sleep?
I think they don't.
There's no time.
Until after the 45-day session is over with.
And then
You're
everybody
already
sleeps for,
teasing
like,
a
2
special
months.
session, so
Yeah. We get a little sleep before the special session.
Just a little bit, though.
This is the press room. We're busy.
That's it for this episode of The Press Room. Hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcasting app. Write a review on Apple Podcasts, and we'll be back next week for the next episode of the Virginia Press Room.